Thank you for joining us today for this EWA National Seminar panel from Bylines Book Jackets Higher Ed. My name is Melissa Korn. I'm a reporter for the Wall Street Journal and co-author of Unacceptable, Privilege, Deceit, and the Making of the College Admissions Scandal, which came out last summer. I'm going to be the moderator for today's conversation. Before we begin, a few housekeeping notes. First, a reminder that this is being recorded. Everything's on the record, including the chats. If you hover over the speaker screen, you should see a button for closed captioning and live transcription. To start viewing closed captioning, click closed caption. To view the live transcript, click live transcript and then select show subtitle. To submit a question for any of the speakers or me, please use the chat box located in the Pathable platform. You can submit questions at any point during the session. Kim from EWA will be monitoring the questions and facilitate the Q&A portion later on. Finally, if you're going to tweet about this, please use the hashtag EWA21. So I'm going to introduce everyone here and we'll get started. I hate doing long bios, as I have told the panelists already. So we've got Adam Harris, a staff writer at The Atlantic, Josh Mitchell, a reporter at the Wall Street Journal, and Andy Thomason, assistant managing editor at the Chronicle of Higher Education. So I figured we could start by giving folks a bit of an overview of your respective projects and where you are in the process. These are certainly not something that happens overnight or over the course of weeks or even months, but often years. So Adam, let's start with you. Where are you in all of this?
Yeah, so my book, The State Must Provide, it will be coming out in August. It's a narrative history of racial inequality in higher ed that, as you mentioned, did not sort of happen overnight. I think that the roots of the idea started when I was back in college, after working at the Chronicle with Andy, I was one of Andy's reporters. I was able to sort of get a deeper knowledge of federal higher education policy, the way that it intersected, and created a lot of the inequitable structures that we recognize today in higher education. And over the course of the next year, turned into a proposal alongside my agent, which I imagine we'll be talking about getting an agent and all that stuff later. Since then, just got to work at the book. We sold it 2 years ago, and it will be coming out in August. So it's nice to be towards the end of the process.
And how about you, Andy? You're the end too.
Yes. So my book, Discredited, the UNC Scandal and College Athletics Amateur Ideal, is coming out also in August. I'm not going to be asking Adam about his sales numbers, I can tell you that much. But it is years in the making. It's about this fake classes scandal that happened at UNC several years ago, implicated the athletics department, and sort of tries to give a narrative treatment to that, and then dig into what the scandal says about the ways that big time athletics and higher education relate to one another on college campuses today. One thing that I'll just say right off the bat is that my perspective, I think, is a little bit different than my co-panelists in that I work directly with an academic press to put this book together. It's the University of Michigan press that's publishing it. So that's all I'll say for now.
Josh?
Okay, so my book, The Debt Trap, comes out August 3rd. It's a narrative history of student loans in the United States. I basically, try to explain how we got here, with the country owing so much in student debt, and why did it grow so quickly over the past 15 years. But it actually starts back in the 50s when the first student loan program came into being. And I guess the thing that I've tried to do with the book is use characters to tell various aspects of the program, but I wanted to, some of the characters are people who were in charge of the program and made a lot of money off of the program. And then you have characters who got into a lot of debt. So I try to do that contrast of the decision makers as well as the people being affected by the decisions. So I hope everyone likes it. Please buy it.
So I I think one of the big questions that we often get as reporters who are authors and is, how did you know that this was going to be a book, right? So there's a really big difference between being a beat reporter, writing about a particular topic oftentimes with fairly short pieces. Big difference between that and putting together 300 pages of text in a compelling manner. So Andy, I'm curious to hear how you knew that the UNC basketball fake class scandal was a book and not just a particularly interesting story that you would cover for a while for the Chronicle.
Yeah, that's a great question. At first, I didn't know it was a book. Someone had to suggest it to me by email that said, have you ever thought about putting this together as a book? And all of a sudden, yeah, it was like a light bulb clicking on in my head. And in retrospect, I think there were a couple of different things that I considered sort of assets to this project at the time. One was hadn't been done. And that's a thing I definitely want to underline for people who'd be thinking about writing books is, has your book actually been done? If it has, maybe consider not doing it. And luckily, we're so close to the events of the scandal that it hadn't been done in quite the way that I'd wanted to do it. Full picture, grappling with the implications on other colleges and stuff like that. Another way that I knew is that there was a voluminous paper trail already out there, hundreds and hundreds of thousands of emails published by UNC that were put together as a result of investigations they'd done into this scandal. And that's gold if you are putting a book together. And so I knew based on that as well. And then also just looking at the way that the college sports landscape is changing so rapidly, I could tell that there was something about this scandal that related to the landscape nationwide. So when I was thinking about that, I just kept getting sign after sign in my mind that this was really something worth pursuing.
Yeah, I also didn't know. I mean, I didn't know that the college admissions scandal was going to be, fodder for a book until Jennifer Levitz, my co-author, and I heard from agents, which was crazy quick. It was, the day it happened, people emailing and saying, this is going to be a book. Do you want to be the ones to write it? Which was both terrifying and thrilling because, I had absolutely no idea what the process looked like. I knew some people who had written fiction, and the process is in some ways quite different. There are some similarities in terms of, they want to see a proposal or sample chapters. You're pitching it around, you're trying to sell yourself, working with an agent to do so. And it's a stressful thing. It can come together very quickly. I think we had our book proposal ready to go and in front of publishers in about 3 weeks from the start date. Or it can take months or years because you've already put in most of the research for the entire book by the time you put the proposal together. And I don't think there's a right or wrong timeline to work on. But this is not a light undertaking. And I think putting together a proposal, a real outline of what the story would look like, is a good reminder of just how deep you're going to have to go. So I think I mentioned, you work with an agent. Josh, how did you find your agent? How did you guys connect?
So we have an economics correspondent in our DC bureau. His name is Greg Ip. He's one of our top writers. He's written a couple books, and I had been batting around this idea of writing a book on student debt. Just to answer your previous question real quick, I wrote this story about a debt forgiveness program in 2015, basically about how there's this provision of the Higher Education Act that entitles people to have their student loans forgiven if they can prove that they were defrauded by their schools. No one really knew about this program, except some activists sort of found this on the books and they started telling people about it. And I wrote this story, and I had 700 emails that afternoon. The emails were coming in so quickly that I couldn't respond to them. I had to put up like an away thing saying like, read this blog post. I'm going to answer all your questions. That was really the first time. I mean, I had been thinking about a book for a while, but that was really the first time that I was like, you know what? Like, as Andy said, no one's done it. Why don't I do it? People have a very passionate hunger for understanding why they're in debt. why we have this whole system, why are college prices rising so quickly. I might as well write that book. I was terribly scared. And I was even scared approaching Greg, who's like my mentor. For some reason, I just felt like I was this imposter to even think that I could write a book. And even broaching the question, I just felt like I was being an imposter. But he said, I think there's something there. He goes, why don't you talk to my agent? His name is Howard Yoon. He's based here in DC. He's done a lot of books with reporters. And it was just like, I think that that's one thing to sort of keep in mind. If you have an idea and you're really scared, all of us were, I'm sure at some point, I know that I was, you just sort of take it one step at a time. So the first step is like going to my mentor. What do you think about this like completely awful, stupid idea that I'm about to give you? I'm like, oh no, actually it's not a stupid idea. Why don't you talk to my agent? I went out to lunch with my agent and he said, or he wasn't my agent at the time, but he's like, oh yeah, he's like, no one's done that. And I didn't even know what type of book I wanted to write on student debt. He sort of helped me frame it. But basically it was just talking with someone who wrote a book. So that's the short answer to your question.
And Adam, how about you? How did you connect with your agent? And was it, word of mouth? Like we went with ours because he had kind of pitched us the best, but also had worked with a bunch of colleagues, and getting their recommendation mattered, right? If the people who you trust and respect liked this person, you're probably going to like them as well.
Yeah, so it was actually because my book in some ways started with the last story that I wrote at the Chronicle on the Black colleges in Mississippi that got a settlement for $500 million split over 17 years between 3 institutions, which was wild because the University of Mississippi makes $500 million in 5 years of private donations, but I digress. Anyway, I moved to the Atlantic and I started getting emails from publishers and also from agents saying, hey, we think that there is a book in you. We think that you might be able to write a book. And I had been following the person who eventually became my agent, Aaliyah, on Twitter for a long time. We had been mutual followers and I knew some folks who she represented. And after I got a couple of emails, I actually just went to my editor and was like, hey, what's the policy on writing books here? And she was like, first I just reach out to an agent and talk to them. And she actually recommended my agent, who I had previously been following on Twitter. So I sent an email and was just like, hey, I think I'm interested in writing a book. I'm not quite sure what I want it to be about at this point, but I would love to chat with you. And so we had a conversation, and the book was actually much more narrow in the beginning. It focused almost explicitly on HBCUs, and as through our conversations over the next couple of months, it broadened out, and it kind of was a more broader exploration of racial inequality in higher education. And as Josh mentioned, as Andy mentioned, kind of picked to the characters from there. And so my agent's literally kind of been there with me from the beginning of the book development phase. And in some ways, I don't know that I would have written this book specifically if not for her help in kind of helping me contextualize and think through, like they were saying, what has not been done already? What is our way to take this and elevate, what's a narrow topic now and show people the broader implications of it.
Yeah, I think a good agent does so much more than just connect you with publishers or get your words in front of potential publishing houses. They often are great editors, great at bouncing ideas off of. We had ours look at early chapters at one point, a few months into the process, just to get his take. He was a really good writer, and that was really helpful. They read a lot. They know what makes a good book, and having a good agent really makes the whole process a lot more manageable and pleasant, perhaps. I do want to talk not just about the pleasant stuff or the good, but also the challenges, right? Writing a book is not an easy undertaking. And I want to get everyone's take on this. What was the hardest part about your project, whatever stage it came at, that you would kind of want to warn others who are perhaps considering writing a book, make sure that they go into the process knowing about? Adam, let's start with you.
Yeah. The first thing is that writing a book is an incredibly isolating experience. And sometimes when you're up late in the evening, it's 11 o'clock, maybe midnight, you're pounding away at it because, I don't know, I didn't take a book leave for the book, so it was just in the after hours or in the early morning. We would have a day off. I would be in the archives. Sometimes I would take a day or two off to go to the archives, but I think that the isolation is just something that it's really hard to prepare for mentally. You're working on something and it ends up being, 50, 60, 70, 80, 90,000 words, and words that few other people are actually going to see outside of your editor, which is, of course, why when you get to this point of, okay, the book's about to come out, it's so nerve-wracking because you're like 7 people have seen this. So I think that's one of the big things, is just how isolating the experience is. And in saying that, also the importance of kind of developing a kind of community of people who are either also writing books, have written books, you can kind of talk to and check in. Because the last thing I'll say is the last couple of months were a little bit easier as I was preparing the first draft of the manuscript, were a little bit easier because I had people that, I did regular check-ins with. It was like every Thursday we would check in and say, hey, how's it going? It's like, this week was terrible. Or, hey, how's it going? It's like, oh, it was better. I don't know that any of the words I wrote will go into the final version of the manuscript, but they're on the page, and that's what matters at this point. So yeah, I think that was kind of the biggest thing for me.
Josh, how about you?
Yeah, it was extremely hard, way harder than I ever thought. I think the hardest part for me was getting used to the scale of the project, which I never really got used to. But at the journal, our longest stories are 2,000 words, and we spend months and months on those. Most of our stories, it's just 600, 700 words. That is like one scene in a book. So you're talking about 70,000, 80,000, 90,000 words. And it took me a very long time to figure out how to outline it. I know that like different writers have different opinions on outlines. I will just tell you, for me, having a framework took a really long time to come to. And I hired an assistant to help me do that, someone that's worked with other authors. And it was only after I sort of knew like the rough outline of each chapter that I could really focus on sort of the writing aspect. Because what I was trying to do from the start was write a 90,000 word newspaper article. And like, I was killing myself, like absolutely killing myself. And so getting used to like moving away from like newspaper articles full of facts to like trying to flesh out, like deciding who the character is in each chapter that you're going to focus on, or like the 1 or 2 characters, and then trying to understand like how to bring them to life, but then also what is the theme that they're helping you flesh out, and how do you organize your chapter around that, and then like it can't just be all facts and factoids. It has to be your voice, and like you trying to tell the reader why you think this is important and what the big takeaway is. All of those things, just having that outline and having a framework up front, I was going in circles until I was able to do that. So that was the hardest part.
What about you, Andy? What kept you up at night? Or keeps you up at night? I don't know.
A lot yeah, exactly. I was about to say my answer is sort of a combination of Adam and Josh's, but basically the fear and the isolation that you feel embarking on a project like this, it hasn't gone away for me. I still feel a lot of that anxiety definitely ramping up as you get closer to publication. And even in preparing for this session, I felt some twinges of Josh talked about imposter syndrome earlier, just sort of like, who am I to be, among book authors and whatnot. So there's definitely that. And I think Adam shared some really good strategies for trying to help with that. But Josh made a really insightful point, which was, thinking about it as a 90,000 word newspaper article. One of the key lessons that I came upon was it's a different animal. It's just a completely different animal. And you might come to it thinking it's just going to be a bigger version of what you already do. But, wrapping your head around this project is challenging. And one of the lessons that I feel like I learned is that it's a different calculus. You know, if you're writing a big takeout online magazine piece, you've got to persuade the reader actively to stay with you in a way that you don't have to do as extremely for a book. They've already made the purchase, or they've checked it out from the library. You have them, and you can lay out your case with a little bit more intention, and maybe a little bit of a slower pace. That's just one example of how it's a different animal. And but the main thing that kept me up at night was just fear, anxiety of just being a part of a project like this.
Yeah, the scope is just so much bigger, that the stakes seem so much higher and all of that. I will say the three of you worked alone, or mostly alone, on your projects. I had a co-author. I did not have those feelings of isolation. I had a boatload of feelings of doubt and imposter syndrome, and being absolutely convinced that we were just never going to get there, right? We were never going to nail down that scene we wanted, or get that document we were looking for, or be able to flesh out a character enough, or whatever it was. And having someone else to kind of pull you up when you are in those moments of despair made it not just manageable, but actually a fun process, right? Like Jennifer and I kind of had a little shtick, we had a little rapport going, that, I would call her and say, oh my God, we're never going to get there. And she would say, we'll get there. We got this. And that was just the refrain for, a year. We'll get there. And that helped. For me, the hardest part, the kind of thing I didn't realize would be so challenging and so labor intensive, was what happens after the book comes out. And publishing during the kind of height of the pandemic was rough times. But your publisher has marketing and publicists and things like that, but you are ultimately doing everything you can to sell your book. So we had our publisher connected us to do a bunch of radio interviews, some podcasts. We got excerpts placed in some nice places, a couple of interviews in print, but setting up book talks with at bookstores, at libraries, podcasts, all of that was stuff that Jennifer and I put together and are continuing to put together. The book came out in July, and we're still trying to do about one event a week. It is a lot. It does not go away just when the book comes out, the book is published. I also, when we discussed in preparation for this, I can't remember who it was who mentioned endnotes as kind of an issue, something that they've learned. Adam, I think you had some strong thoughts on that. Do you want to talk for a sec?
I do have strong thoughts on endnotes, and my strong thought is that you should be doing them as you're going through the first draft process, rather than, okay, we're at the end of, we've gone through a couple iterations of the draft, and you may hear my daughter crying in the background, but we're going through a couple iterations of the draft, and okay, now I need to turn in the endnotes, and so let me go back through, and this will serve as a fact check, as one of the initial fact checks before we send it off for additional fact checking. And that was just the wrong call. The endnotes ended up being an incredibly labor intensive thing, and they were things that you would it's oh, I know I saw this somewhere, and you just can't place it in the when you're going back through. So doing endnotes as you are writing, strongly recommend.
And Josh, you worked with an assistant. Talk a little bit about that process and how, why that was a help for you.
Yeah, I was writing in circles for months and months and months, and I wasn't getting anywhere. And so I just realized I needed help. I mean, you kind of have to admit at some point, it's not working and you need to do something. I was hesitant to hire someone because, you can spend a lot of money. And so, depending on how big your advance is, how much you want to take off work, you kind of have to figure out how much money you have to work with. But I came to think of hiring an assistant as an investment rather than a cost, because number one, I was not going to finish the project without the help of someone. But number two, if you find the right person, they are going to make it a good product that you're going to be able to be proud of and sell. So one of my pieces of advice, if you want to embark on this project, is really consider hiring someone. And that could be a fact checker. It could be, someone like a writing coach. It can be, like someone who does research for you. You can go to the Library of Congress and dig up, whatever you need dug up. But depending on the scale of the project, I mean, I have a friend who's working on a really expedited timeline right now, and where he has to, get a book done really quickly, and it's a really massive, subject. And I just told him, like, I think you really need to hire someone. It'll just make things easier. And like the other thing is talk to people, talk around, because there's a lot of, like, obviously former reporters who like and are looking for these type of projects. And so there's a whole industry that I don't think people know about that you have access to. You just need to really try to find them. Because there are people that can do all the three things. There are people that can fact check and research and help you with the writing and just sort of be like your handyman. And it'll be an investment in the long run. So if you need help finding someone like that, I have people that I can put you in touch with.
I'm curious who edited your book, who looked over your book, and it could be your editor, or it could be a family member or friend. Adam, you said that kind of, especially toward the end, you had this community of folks that were also going through the process or various stages. And you noted, maybe 7 people have seen it before it comes out. Who did see it, and what advice were you looking for by that stage? Let's start with you, Andy.
Sure. So the first reader was my wife, who was a great reader of it in its very initial stages. I had a former editor from the Chronicle who was like essential. And I think for me, he played a role akin to what Josh was just talking about. Somebody who will be an editor to your book. And later, my actual editor at the press would give me great edits. But while I was actually putting it together, just like for a big, long story that you might, do in a magazine, like you need an editor on site giving you feedback while you're working. That's really, really helpful. So that was another person. His feedback was essential. And then my editor, copy editors, a lawyer reviewing, and then one unconventional thing that happens with academic presses is peer review. So my book is a narrative nonfiction, styled like a trade book, but it's being published by an academic press. It still underwent peer review, which was interesting to get people commenting on your manuscript who are like at universities and stuff. So that's my rundown.
And Adam, who was in your inner circle, who's read the full thing before it comes out?
Yeah. So it was funny, actually, before the first draft, the only 2 people who really saw versions of chapters were my agent and my editor. I really trusted my agent just from the development of the book. I really like her as an editor. And then we ended up selling the book at auction, and Denise, my editor, was just fantastic, and I really liked you brought her line. And I really liked kind of her vision and direction and the way that she was thinking about and the ideas alongside me. And so it was really, we actually kind of set up a deadline structure where, like, every couple of months I would file her a couple of chapters, so that she was able to kind of look at the book in its individual parts, give me notes on those individual parts as I was finishing other parts of the book. And then it was like we already kind of had a first run of edits before I had to return it, with the second run of edits as the full manuscript. So before, I guess, May of last year, it was really just those folks and the people who I had talked to, who were also writing books. It was more of like a sounding board as opposed to actually reading individual pages. It was like we are both going through this process, and on top of that, kind of talking through the general ideas in the book. Since then, it's been, as Josh mentioned, kind of hiring fact checkers, centered around to academics, that I respected to kind of get their read on it, to make sure that, you know, there's not just like a bunch of glaring errors in the book, and you know, copy editors, and we had a proofreader, and so all of the kind of structural people at the press read the book, and then, you know, some outside folks who you know, I was, you know, really keen on getting their thoughts on it.
So I'm going to do a moderator's prerogative here and remind everybody, if you have questions, please submit them in the chat on the Pathable platform. We want to know what we can tell you that's actually of particular interest to you. I will say, if you're going through this process and want, you know, another set of eyes on it, find somebody who loves you enough to tell you the truth. So my dad was actually our first reader. He's just a voracious reader and very blunt, and it was so helpful. It was before our editor had even seen the full story, the full piece, and he was sending like chapter by chapter. It was middle of the pandemic. He's retired. He was really bored. It was great for him. And that was helpful. Some editors, like Adam's, want to see a few chapters at a time. Others, like mine, didn't want to see it until it was done. So it was really weird to not get feedback incrementally throughout. We were also on a really rushed timeline. I will say, the editing process at a publishing house, someone told me this and I kind of laughed it off, but it was very true. And Josh, I'm sure you felt this as well, that writing a front page story for the Wall Street Journal would be edited more heavily. You know, that story would be edited more heavily than a book. And it was true. It really was, in terms of, I mean, yes, the whole apparatus of proofreaders and typesetters and all that for the book. But in terms of line edits, an everyday story for me at the Journal gets more eyes and hands on it than the book did, I think, which is terrifying in a lot of ways. Our best edit, perhaps our most thorough edit, came from the lawyers, the legal team. That was really helpful and really reassuring. Josh, what about you?
Yeah, that this kind of ties into what you were asking about, like, how was the adjustment to writing a book? Like, what was one of the tough things about it? And I came to think of it as, like, my publisher, Simon & Schuster, I kind of had to accept that they aren't the newspaper. They are considering me the brand. So, like, when you and I are writing a front page story, the brand is protecting itself, and they want to make sure that Josh Mitchell's voice does not come through too much, because they need to protect the Wall Street Journal brand. And that's why they are such a great brand. With Simon & Schuster, they're like, no, you're the brand, and we're not going to overly edit your stuff because we want this to be your voice. They didn't explicitly say this, but this is my interpretation. And so a lot of their questions and edits were sort of like big picture, high level, but not like, you know, and they would be like, oh, you need a better transition here or there, but they were not heavy handed. And part of that is just because they're like looking to me to, this is my book. It's not really, I mean, it's their book, but it's my book. It's my voice. And so it was just a really, really extremely challenging transition to make, to be like people looking to me versus me being able to turn to layers of editors for advice. So
we have a couple of questions that have come through. I'm going to start with one from Larry Gordon. He says, I have shelves of higher ed books, but I sometimes think some would have been better as hefty magazine articles instead. And that in part has deterred me personally from taking on my own book project. Any thoughts? My initial take is, if you don't know what to write in your proposal, right? Like if you don't have enough information for a 15-page proposal, you're probably not going to have enough for a 90,000 word book. And if you can't think of at least 3 or 4, if you're trying to do narrative nonfiction, if you can't think of at least 3 or 4 characters that you want to and can get really deep into and really create as full-on humans, it's going to be a brutal process, and it's going to be dry, right? You need to, so that's one of the big differences, I think, is having real characters. And you can do that in a magazine length and a book, but you need to know that you're going to have the goods before you embark. So thinking through who the people are in your book, who the villains are and who the heroes are, and who the victims are, because usually there's some combination of those in all of these stories, is kind of a good barometer, a good first pass of whether there's really enough to write that people would want to read. Josh, Andy, and Adam, do you guys have any other thoughts on that one? Josh?
I think, well, I think part of it depends on like what your goal is and what your audience, who you think your audience is. Like if you want to write a best-selling book, you know, versus a history book, I mean, each of those have two audiences that are going to buy the book, you know, and it just depends on what your goal is. But I totally agree that some books would be much better as like magazine articles. But I guess for me, like the question is, okay, like, is there a bigger picture that you can't do in a magazine article? And I felt that way with student loans. It was like, I've seen all of these different elements written about. And Adam, I think this is like your book too. It's like, you know, I've seen articles on HBCUs, I've seen articles on, you know, what have you, but is there sort of a bigger picture where you have the opportunity to tie different elements together that would justify a book? And Andy, I have a sense that yours is going to be like that too, with athletics and the growth of, you know, sports and the NCAA, you know. So it's kind of a, yeah, I guess it's just a case by case basis. What is the bigger picture that you want to write about? I think that would be the question to answer.
It sounds like such a an elementary way to phrase this, but yeah, part of it is this a big enough deal? Is this, yeah, does, like you said, Melissa, with the proposal, if you struggle to write the proposal, it may not be worth a book. But Larry definitely articulates what would be my greatest fear, or one of my greatest fears about the books, that somebody picks it off a shelf, reads it, and it's like, I don't think it needed to be a book. Like all this labor you've sunk into it, how terrible would that be? But I just want to express some support for what you said, Melissa, about character. I think that is key, because that's one of the freedoms that you have with a book, is that you are able to get people invested in these characters' lives. And then, I mean, I know from just reading my favorite books that it's often the sense of the person that you come away with from a great book remembering. And that feels like one of the greatest rewards of reading a great book, is feeling like you know this person. And then obviously that investment allows you to say certain things about the world, and who is who you know, in these systems, who becomes victims, all that sort of stuff.
We have a question from Nell Gluckman saying, you mentioned that the writing was really different from writing a long article. How about the reporting? Do the same rules and methods apply? I'll say that Jennifer and I determined early on that we would maintain the same standard of reporting that we use at the Journal, in terms of no surprises. So if somebody was going to be mentioned in the book, you know, in pretty much in more than just a name on a list or something, we were going to try to get in touch with them and make sure it wasn't a surprise to them and give them a chance to respond, which involved flying to different parts of the country, leaving notes on doors and mailboxes, having people call their lawyers and say, I feel like this person is stalking me. But we really, I mean, we wanted to make every effort, especially because it was about ongoing litigation, right? Like we didn't want anyone to say that we'd kind of not really let them tell their side of the story. So we maintained that throughout. We also kind of set up the same, you know, background sources, off the record, on the record, those sorts of things. And from that regard, it was very similar to the way I write my dailies or my front page stories. Anyone else want to chime in on that one, on the reporting?
Yeah, mine was different in that, you know, as it dealt a lot more with archives than you know, a traditional daily story. And so I think that part of the reporting process, I'd actually, you know, thanks in large part to that last story that I wrote for the Chronicle, I'd already like started just like, okay, I'm gonna have to sit down and read through this old, you know, board hearing from Mississippi's higher education board in the 1970s, or I'm gonna have to read through this old Supreme Court case, or whatever it may be. So I think just shifting my mindset into, I'm reading through newspaper archives and just all of these different sorts of archives, and not just reading for, okay, I just need like a specific thing from this, but also reading the context around it. I mean, if I was reading an old an old newspaper from Kentucky and in the 1800s, then I'm probably going to read the entire spread of page one, or maybe even page one and page two, just so that I can see what was kind of going on in the area. And that's been incredibly, that was kind of the most radical departure for me, is spending more time in the archives.
On the other side of the coin, just one thing to highlight about doing, so I did a bunch of interviews for my book, and a lot of uncomfortable interviews. And one of the ways that a book can actually help you is if you're operating on a longer timeline. A lot of times sources who might be initially uncomfortable with talking with you, it can be a little bit easier to approach them if you have a longer timeline to work with, because you can be a little bit more cautious and intentional about making that approach. And I had that work with me in several instances, and the book wouldn't have been as good without those people. So yeah, as opposed to a magazine piece, or if you're on like a 3-month deadline, even that might be too soon to really get some people.
Yeah, we had people who only started talking to us, a week before our manuscript was due, which was challenging, but we made it work. I'm going to be the worst moderator ever, and I have to leave a minute early. But I love talking to people about their book projects, and if they have questions, I am happy to answer any of them, the good, the bad, the ugly. My contact info, I believe, is in the profile in the Pathable platform. So Kim, I'm going to let you take it from here, and I'm going to sign off.
Before you sign off, I had one question, just quick round robin. What was the average numbers of hours of sleep you got during your reporting and writing process? Melissa, go.
5 to maybe 6. I don't function on less than that. I really can't.
Josh?
There were many nights of 4, because I would try to get 5 to 6, but then I was so stressed I couldn't sleep. So
Andy, how many?
I really value sleep. So what I did was I just pushed my wake up time to 5 a.m. and then I pushed my go to bed time like down to embarrassing times that I won't even mention.
Okay, Adam?
Average, I would probably say about 5. But on the crash, like the really like, oh, this is a crash night, like I was finishing a college paper, it would, as Andy said, just ungodly hours. Okay.
All right, I'll let Melissa go. I did want to say one other thing that came up in the other book talk, which is, many EWA members have used EWA's fellowships or other fellowships, such as the Spencer Fellowship, to fund or kickstart their research for a book. If you have a book idea and you need time and money to just at least do the first initial pre-reporting to see if it's a good idea, we look at EWA's fellowships and look at the other fellowships. I think Patrick O'Donnell is here. He's probably thinking about that. So there are resources to help you sort of kickstart your book project. I'm afraid we're running out of time. This has been a wonderful conversation and very inspiring. I just want to say that everybody who's attending this will get an email later this week or early next week with a survey asking about what you liked, what you didn't like. And I know it's a pain to fill out those surveys, but we really do look at each one and they do help us improve our offerings. So please fill it out. Finally, what's next? So tomorrow is our last day. And at noon, we're going to have a plenary session on the use of race in admissions to all kinds of schools, not just colleges, but selective high schools and magnet schools and so on. And we also have some data training, free data training. So please tune in tomorrow. Thanks, everybody, and have a great evening.